Hi guys, what I find extremely funny, but not in a ha-ha sort of way, is how Tories and their supporters in the media will criticise the Labour government for having a means-tested system when it comes to providing support for pensioners, but rail against the idea of providing children with something to eat. In many cases, Conservatives will say that it's wrong to implement a system where rich kids end up getting a free breakfast, so the whole system has to be reformed. However, there's another type of Tory who wants to do away with free meals altogether for kids, it seems. Deane, a failed Tory candidate, is one of those.
Of course, children should be able to learn, and they're going to need to have food in their belly to learn. I don't think anyone disputes that. But absolute poverty in this country is vanishingly small. Relative poverty, which the left like to talk about, will always be with us because, of course, as people earn more, relative poverty will continue to exist. But the most important thing here is that almost all families will prioritise their children above all things. And not feeding your child isn't a question for resource for the vast majority of people in this country. It's a question of benign or willful neglect.
Well, we're living in the age of the food bank. I don't know how you can say that so glibly.
I'm not saying it glibly, I'm saying it, I think it's quite profound that the first duty of parents is to feed their children. And if your suggestion is, it's glib to say that, families that have disposable income or have any kind of resource should prioritise feeding their children first, then I'm not sure it's me that's being glib.
I do think there's something a bit odd about this whole kind of notion that is often said very nonchalantly that people don't feed their children. We've got child benefits in this system, in this country. We've got a welfare state. There's lots of help and support.
The question you should be asking is not why are people relying on these things. The question should be, is the support they're receiving enough? Obviously, it's not enough if people have to go to food banks. It's not enough if they have to rely on charity. The question should not be, why are people not doing this? Why are they doing this why they're not feeding their children if they're receiving benefits? The question should be, are the benefits sufficient? Well, obviously they're not in many cases.
Also the voluntary sector that do things like you describe, food banks and so on and so forth. So how is it, do you think, that a parent honestly would say, I can't give my child a slice of bread, or I can't give it some cereal or whatever? I mean, do you think, honestly, people really are that poor that they can't get a loaf of bread for their child?
Well, I think there are some people who actually can't make the money last from week to week. I think we do know that is the case. I wouldn't want to quantify that, and I'm not saying there aren't people who could do better, but I think we definitely know that is the case.
But we all do agree, though, that whatever money you have, you must surely choose to prioritise.
That was my very point. And just to make the point, there are very poor families in this country who manage to feed their children and feed them well, and there are going to be wealthy couples and wealthy parents who neglect their children and don't feed them well because they're bad parents. It's not about money, it's about parenting and neglect.
What better way to talk about poverty than have a panel of middle-class people? I don't know about the Labour guy, but the other two are certainly middle class, or maybe even more than that. Anyway, look, they talked here about, this guy here, Alex, talked about absolute poverty and relative poverty and how it's tiny. Well, there's two issues with that. First of all, it's not tiny. It's about 10% of the population is in poverty, be it absolute or relative. But there's no mention of how to fix that. Well, why talk about fixing poverty when you can just offload responsibility onto somebody else? It's not the government's fault. It's parents' fault. It's for making wrong life choices and stuff like this. Now, the point raised here, of course, is why are some parents not feeding their children? There are a number of reasons for that. And once again, it could have been very simple. Instead of a bunch of middle-class people talking about this, actually go and interview some people and ask them yourselves, the people who rely on food banks, some of the parents who are relying on sending their kids to school to get something to eat. Look, the rising cost of living has reduced many parents' ability to cover things like bills and rent. This means that they're cutting back on meals, both for themselves and their kids, and we've seen multiple examples of that. If they don't pay the gas bill, for example, it's cut off, and it can be very expensive to have it reconnected. So many parents may decide, look, let's skip a meal for today so we have enough money to cover the rent or to cover the bills. Hoping that things will improve. Maybe, send the kids to school, they get fed there. Time can also be a problem for many parents. If they're working a number of jobs, maybe they're starting very early in the morning and they can't be there to make sure that their kids actually eat breakfast. So, because sometimes it's not just a case of there not being any food. In many cases, the children are not being supervised and they're not eating healthy, or they're not eating at all. There's no mention of the mental health crisis either, which has exploded in the last number of years. Many parents are struggling mentally at this moment, and they're not in the right state of mind to ensure that their kids eat the right food or are fed like before. Also, access to food can be a massive problem. Is there a supermarket nearby that provides fresh fruit and vegetables, healthy food? Or is it just an expensive mini market which only provides low quality, poor food at a very low price? Many parents may prefer to, as I said, send their kids to school to ensure that they get high quality food for free. So there are a number of factors here as to why parents may skip a meal for themselves or their kids, hoping that things will improve, or relying on a charity or the school. But none of these things were brought up here, of course. It's all, well, it's just your fault. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.